Because one thing I've learned is this, in politics and in combat, cowardice is contagious, but so is courage. And if you're willing to be the first person over those ramparts, you will be shocked at how many people will come with you. I'm asking you to come with me. I'm asking you to be a part of the generation that will restore the promise of this country and breathe new life into it.
Hi, this is Nick Freitas, and welcome to Making the Argument. Today is day one in a 10-part series where we're going over specific legislative policies. We're talking about problems, we're giving examples of the problems, and then we're talking about the different bills or legislation that can be submitted in order to solve these things. And these are bills that I plan to either support or carry once I get to Washington after winning on November 3rd. So for the next 10 episodes, that's what we're going to be covering. And we're once again encouraging everybody, if you want to ask questions about the specific issues that we're going to be talking about, go to podcast.nick4va.com and you can actually submit questions that we will read or incorporate into our overall solution that we discuss as we do these on a week-by-week basis. So episode 1, we're going over transparency, reform, and how to fix Washington, D.C., how they do business. Specifically, we're looking at what are the different things that Congress does right now that pretty much everyone hates. You can look at the polling and what you see is Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal. There are certain things that Congress does with respect to how they do business that pretty much everyone hates, and yet they still do it. So why do they keep doing it, and why do they keep getting away with it? Well, the reason why they do it is because it benefits them. The reason they get away with it is because they don't feel enough pain during election time to actually fix the problem. But we're going to talk about a couple of examples and how we can actually push people and push our legislators to make the right decisions. And step one is always elect people that will be honest with you about what they believe and what they plan to do about it. It's really easy to get up and say, we're going to fix the way DC does business. But unless you're actually coming forward with solutions on how to do it, don't believe them. We're coming forward with solutions because we're serious about this. So the first one I want to talk about is what we all affectionately call in politics horse trading, right? It's this idea that, okay, maybe you don't like some aspect of my bill, maybe I don't like some aspect of your bill, but if you add this or you do this, then hey, no problem, maybe we can get to an agreement. Now, I think all of us understand that there's always room for honest compromise. There's always room when you're talking about a particular issue where you might say, okay, I don't like the way you're approaching the issue here, but if you tweak this, then that's something I could vote for. Nobody's got a problem with it. That's pretty cut and dry. We expect that sort of compromise and debate to take place when we're considering legislation. What nobody likes is this idea that, hey, I've got this bill that does X. Let's say this is the clean air bill, and this bill is going to be good for cleaning the environment. And another congressman comes over and goes, well, I don't know if I really like your bill, but if we were to add some funding for a particular plant in my district, or if there was a certain grant that went to a university in my district as a part of your bill, maybe then I'd consider it. That's the sort of thing nobody likes to see, especially when that funding or that extra piece that gets added into the bill has nothing to do with the underlying purpose of the legislation in the first place. And you got examples of this all over Washington, D.C. The Green New Deal is a perfect example of this. COVID is probably the most relevant and best example up front, when all of a sudden you're looking at legislation that is supposed to address COVID issues specifically. And so there's money for ventilators, there's money for PPE, there's money for first responders, and everyone agrees with that. It's perfectly relevant. Then all of a sudden there's millions of dollars of funding for the Kennedy Center, right? Where everyone's looking at this going, why is this in there? Well, it's really simple. It's in there for one of two reasons. Either somebody had to get on board with the plan and so they wanted to have a favor done for them or their district, or you have something where they know that nobody in Congress wants to vote against the COVID bill. So they add a bunch of spending on things that have nothing to do with COVID. It's their own little pet projects. It's something they think that's going to help them get reelected. And so they cram that into a bill that it does not belong in, and then they dare people to vote against it for that reason. And what this does is it provides cover. So now when the congressperson comes home and has to explain their votes, they can say, well, I really didn't like all this stuff over here, but gosh, we had to get the spending for ventilators, or we had to get the spending for those local hospitals, and so I went along with it, right? That's the problem. Nobody likes that. It's a dishonest way to do business. So how do we fix it? Well, the solution really isn't that difficult. It's called one subject per bill or one issue per bill. And really what this has to do with is germaneness issues. So it goes back to the whole idea that if you submit a bill for a particular purpose, then the only things in that bill should address that specific purpose. If you're talking about education, well, then there shouldn't be defense spending in there. If you're talking about defense, well, then there shouldn't be transportation spending in there unless it's specifically tied to defense, right? This is common sense. If we were talking about the business world, or if we were talking about the way that we solve problems within our families or within civic organizations, we don't sit there and try to add on a bunch of other stuff to get what we want. We address a particular issue and we try to find some sort of way to come to a common agreement. But in DC, they love doing this because it essentially allows everybody to do favors for everyone else, vote for things that they know are bad, but hey, they got theirs with respect to a certain budget line or with respect to a certain regulation or whatever it might be in order to help their reelection bid. And the only way that we're going to stop it is if we start to pass one subject per bill legislation. And what's so great about this is that if you look at something like the COVID bill, all of us agreed, for the most part, everyone agreed that yes, certain government spending or resource allocation in order to address critical medical needs and critical resource needs at a time during a pandemic is appropriate. So great, why don't we actually talk about those particular budget line items, or why don't we talk about those particular issues that we're trying to address? And then if you still want to put money for the Kennedy Center or money for theaters or whatever pet project you might like, you can still do that, but you have to do it separate from the actual meat of what we're trying to do in the bill. And for those people that say that it can never happen, I would just remind everyone that in 46 different state legislatures across the country, there are strict germaneness rules. Here in Virginia, we have germaneness rules. If somebody tries to change a bill too much, then it's automatically cut because you cannot do that. We want to make sure that we are going through a transparent process to where when a citizen picks up this bill and reads it, they can understand what the purpose of the bill is and what it actually accomplishes or what incentive structures it creates within the law. But that becomes increasingly difficult to do when you allow the sort of dishonest horse trading that currently takes place in Washington, D.C. So the problem is the horse trading. The solution, one subject per bill. Now, a lot of people will say that this is going to extend the process. It's going to require more votes. It's going to require more bills. Yes, it will, but it will also be easier for citizens and legislators to understand what a bill actually does, and we can have an honest up or down vote about what this legislation does, as opposed to all these tricks that are used by politicians in order to give themselves cover. Problem number 2, and reform that we need in Washington, D.C. in order to fix the way D.C. does business, has to do with the legislature not doing its job or oftentimes abdicating its lawmaking authority and responsibility over to executive branch agencies. What do I mean by this? Well, along with bills that are crammed with a bunch of stuff that has nothing to do with the underlying purpose of the bill, you also have the problem of bills being written that are so broad and so open that it essentially allows regulatory agencies to write thousands of pages of regulations based off of a poorly worded bill. And again, Green New Deal is a perfect example of this. A lot of your clean energy bills, a lot of your environmental policy bills, right? They write something with a very, very broad objective, and then the next thing you know, the EPA is writing hundreds, if not thousands of pages of regulations that your business now has to comply with and that your legislators never actually voted on. So if you look at the Constitution and the whole purpose of the legislature, it was the idea that the legislative body, the body that is supposed to be the closest to the people, is the only ones that are allowed to make law. And the reason for that process is because you can hold your legislators accountable through the election process. How do you hold a federal regulator, or how do you hold the head of a particular administrative agency accountable? It's really difficult to do, which is why we keep the lawmaking authority in the hands of the legislator. But the way they often get around this is they write, again, a broadly worded bill which empowers an executive branch agency to write regulations which have the force of law. So the executive branch will always come back and say, hey, look, it wasn't our fault. We were just trying to execute what the legislature said. The legislature, and specifically your politicians, say, oh, well, we didn't know they would interpret it that way. We don't like that regulation, but hey, it wasn't our fault. That's the administrative state. No, it's both sides' fault, and it's the legislature's job to fix it. And so the way that we fix problems like this is with legislation like the REINS Act. And the REINS Act was carried by Senator Rand Paul. And what it does is it tells regulatory agencies and it tells the legislature that when we are submitting bills, because there's nothing inherently wrong with having the executive branch weigh in and create regulations. That's part of the process between the legislature and the executive branch in order to make sure that what the legislature wants is carried out effectively, efficiently, and within the intention of what the lawmakers had in mind in the first place. However, those regulations should have a process whereby the legislature gets to take a second look at them once they're created in order to determine whether or not it meets the true intention of the bill. And if the regulatory agency has gone way beyond what the intent was, then we should be able to stop those regulations from going into place before they are implemented rather than afterwards. And so the REINS Act creates a process where when regulatory agencies are writing especially very, very onerous or expensive regulations, that the legislature has to take a second look at that before they are implemented. And what I think this really does is it gets to the true spirit of, once again, ensuring that lawmaking power is kept within the hands of the legislature and it's not inappropriately delegated off to administrative or executive branch agencies. And what's our third problem that we're going to address with respect to the way Washington, D.C. does business? Well, it's career politicians. Once you see politics as a career instead of a term of service, I think it really changes the way that you actually look at the process and the role that you have as a legislator within a free society. If you look at the way the Constitution was written, if you look at the whole culture of politics at the founding, what you saw was the intention to have more of a citizen-oriented legislature. That was somebody that went up to Washington, D.C. or went to their respective state capitals, did the people's business, and then got back to the farm, back to their shop, back to their business to do what their real job would be. Congress was supposed to be service, not a career. But unfortunately, you have a situation now where people have been in office for several decades. And I think at some point, we've really got to ask ourselves, have we gone beyond what was really intended by the whole concept of service within elected office? Now, that doesn't mean that somebody can't be in office for several decades and do a good job. What we really have to ask ourselves, though, is that the norm, or should it be the norm? Or is this something where we want to give citizens an opportunity to serve their country within a legislature and then go back to their real jobs? Now, one of the ways that we can address this is term limits. Senator Ted Cruz has a great piece of legislation that would limit U.S. senators to 2 terms, and it would also limit members of the House to 3 terms. There's also been some options that go up to 4 terms, right? I think it's important to understand that the whole purpose of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people is that we don't have this separation between career politicians and the people themselves. The politicians are supposed to come from the people. And there is a culture that you see within both state legislatures and up in D.C., but especially in D.C. because it is a professional legislature. And so term limits is one of the ways that we can ensure that politicians are switched out. Nobody has a monopoly on good ideas. And I think one of the reasons why we have a problem, not just with career politicians, but a huge administrative state and regulatory environment, is because we have career politicians that are always coming up with new ways to implement their grandiose plans for our lives. So I think term limits is a great way to put that in check. Now, another approach that we can take is going back to the true spirit of what I think Congress was supposed to be all the time, and that is the citizen legislature. Now, whenever I talk about Congress going back to more of a citizen legislature model, which would essentially be a case where if you're a member of Congress, you would go up to Congress for the beginning of the year, you would work on legislation for a few months, and then you would go back home. You wouldn't go back every couple of weeks. You would go back home to your real job. Now, you might come back later in the summer in order to adjust things that you needed to on the budget. But your legislative session, or the amount of time you spend in Washington, D.C., would be much, much shorter. That way, you see DC as a place that you visit to do your job on behalf of the people, and you see your district as your home. Right now, we've got a lot of people that once they get elected to Congress, they move their house, they move their family to Washington, D.C., and their district is some faraway place that they visit. It's not where they live and it's not where they work. We need to change that dynamic. Now, again, for those of you who think that it's insane to think that we could ever have a citizen legislature in Washington, D.C., I would just remind everyone that out of the 50 state legislatures that we have, 46 of them are citizen legislatures. There are only 4 full-time legislatures at the state level in the United States. It's California, New York, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Every other state has some form of a citizen legislature where you go for a very specific period of time, you get the people's business done, and then you get back to your real job. You're not making hundreds of thousands of dollars being an elected official. You're not making tens of thousands of dollars being an elected official. The pay rate for a delegate in Virginia is $17,500 per year. That's enough to cover, your office expenses. It's enough to cover gas. It's enough to compensate you for the process of going down there and being involved in the legislature. But it's not a full-time salary, and it's not meant to be. And I don't see why we can't do something similar on the federal level, where people in Congress are still expected to have jobs. That way, once they get into Washington, D.C., they have an incentive to get there, get their business done, and then get back to their real job that they're using to pay their mortgage. I think that actually has a good tempering effect on politicians, and it changes the mindset. And I see this in Richmond all the time, where when we know we have a 60-day deadline from start to finish to be able to get the bills passed, to be able to get a biannual budget through, to make sure that that budget is balanced, we work really hard in order to make sure that we can do that within that 60-day period for 2 reasons. One, we know our constituents, we know those local governments are counting on us to get that budget done and to get these bills passed so that they can go on a regular work schedule with the mission that they have to accomplish. And 2, our people need to get back to work as well. So it creates positive incentives, and it cuts into this whole idea of this political elite or this political class that inevitably starts to develop when you have people that are there for decades and what they see as a career instead of a term of service. Okay, so to recap, first problem, horse trading, right? The idea that politicians are putting a bunch of things into a piece of legislation that has nothing to do with the underlying purpose of the bill. How do we solve it? One subject per bill. You see Senator Rand Paul carrying this in the Senate. You see Congressman Andy Biggs carrying it in the House. So the legislation is there. I fully plan to support it. I think it has broad bipartisan support because really what this is about is honesty, transparency, and making sure that everyone knows what they're voting on and making sure that our constituents understand what we're voting on and why we voted for it. So one subject per bill. Second problem, the legislature handing off its lawmaking responsibility to executive branch and regulatory agencies. How do we solve it? REINS Act. Senator Rand Paul is carrying this in the Senate. I know we have a House companion as well, but this is a bill that I will absolutely support because it once again requires the legislature to take responsibility, not just for the broadly worded bills that they pass, but also for the regulations which are made in the name of the bill that was created in the first place. And then the third problem, career politicians. How do we address it? One of the most simple ways is through term limits. A little bit more radical method is through insisting on a citizen legislature. But I would just remind everyone, even that more radical method is actually adopted by 46 of the 50 state legislatures throughout the country. So it's not impossible to conceive of. But I will absolutely support term limits. I will absolutely support any sort of method which gets politicians into D.C. to do their job for a limited period of time and then kicks them back out to their districts in the real world so they can actually see how what they do in D.C. affects people within their district. I want to thank you all for joining us for this podcast. Again, we're going to be going through this for the next 10 weeks. We're going to be discussing real problems in D.C. and the various solutions that I'm putting forward or that I support in order to fix those problems. So next week, we're going to be talking about criminal justice reform. and law enforcement reform. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the conversation about this has almost become anti-law enforcement. I don't think that's genuine criminal justice reform. And so we're going to go over what is a common sense, reasonable approach to ensure that the police have the training they need to effectively do their job, that citizens are protected, and that we have a process through our prison system which punishes bad behavior but also adds an opportunity for rehabilitation and reintegration into society once someone has paid their debt to their victim or to society in general. So I'm looking forward to going through all of that tomorrow. If you have certain questions that you would like us to address with respect to criminal justice reform, please go to podcast.nic4va.com. And what we would ask is that if you have questions, if you have general questions, we're going to actually have opportunities to discuss those as well. But for these specific podcasts, we would ask that you limit your questions to the purpose of that particular podcast. So if you've got a question on what's the conservative approach to criminal justice reform, or how do we take care of law enforcement while at the same time holding accountable those officers which do abuse their power, these are great questions for us to be able to address within the next podcast. And with that, we are going to move on to some of the questions that we had for this podcast. So one of the questions that we got asked from a transparency perspective was about the mail-in voting. And I think what a lot of people see of this, or the problem that a lot of people have with this, is the potential for voter fraud when you're talking about mail-in voting. And so I've had people ask, do you think we should engage in mail-in voting if it's the only option presented? Well, here's what I would tell you. In most states, there's a difference between mail-in voting and absentee voting. Absentee voting is where you go out and you actually request an absentee ballot. And so there's a lot less potential for fraud in a case like that because it's the voter themselves requesting the ballot, requesting it at the proper address. It allows the registrar to ensure that the person requesting the ballot is actually registered to vote. And so there's a lot more fail-safes in there to make sure that absentee balloting provides someone an opportunity to vote that might not otherwise have access. Maybe they're going to be traveling. Maybe they're going to be out of the country. Maybe they're in one of the risk categories and they don't feel safe going up to a polling location. So absentee voting actually provides, I think, a fairly safe and a certainly legitimate way for their voice to be heard. And I wouldn't discourage anybody from voting by absentee if that's the way that they feel is best for them to be able to make sure their voice is heard in November. Now, the whole concept of mail-in voting, and you have certain states like Colorado, like Oregon, where they have gone to a mail-in voting system where really that's the only way you can vote. Yeah, I have a huge problem with that because unfortunately we have a lot of problems within our voter rolls which are maintained by the registrar. And so when we're just mailing out ballots to the entire state or mailing out ballots to the entire country, there is a huge opportunity for voter fraud in those cases where people are either stealing ballots out of a mailbox and now the registrar doesn't know, is this coming from the person that they actually sent it to? Is it coming from somebody else? It allows for vote harvesting in a way that is very, very antithetical to the integrity of our elections. And so there are a lot of problems with mail-in voting. And so from a government transparency perspective, I think one of the things that we have to recognize is that while the federal government does have some role with respect to election law, we see that with things like the Civil Rights Act, that the reason why we have maintained this as a state responsibility is because we understand that different states are different. They have different geographical issues that they're trying to address. And so it is best to leave this to the states through our federalist system. And so I oppose attempts like H.R. 1 that Abigail Spanberger voted for, where they were encouraging more mail-in voting. And then they were also doing other things in there that just made absolutely no sense. Like, for instance, the public financing of campaigns. Abigail Spanberger voted for a bill that would require government dollars to be spent up to $5 million per election cycle per candidate. That's absurd. I can't imagine a worse way for the government to spend your dollars than to take it from you and then to make you give it to politicians. If a politician wants you to contribute to their campaign, they should have to ask you to do that. They shouldn't be able to force you to do it through taxes or through fines or fees. And that was one of the other things that I thought was interesting. You want to talk about a transparency issue. How about the fact that when people were getting very upset that Democrats were voting to have tax dollars be used to fund their political campaigns, they changed it and said, oh, no, it's different. It won't be tax dollars. It's going to be fines and fees. So let me get this straight. We already have a problem with what we call policing for profit, where police are actually incentivized by their legislatures to go out and enforce laws or write tickets in order to increase their own budget. We've recognized this as a problem and we're trying to stop it. And then what does Abigail Spanberger do? She votes for a bill which actually encourages the police to go out and do fines and fees so that it can go into campaign contributions for politicians that are running for office. I think that is completely wrong-headed. I think that if they actually talked about what this bill did, if they were more transparent about what this bill did, they never would have got it passed, because I don't think very many people would put up with something like that. So when it comes to the difference between absentee and mail-in voting, know the differences. But again, if the only way you can vote is by absentee or mail-in, I'm certainly not going to discourage you from doing so. But there are different ways that you can pressure your state legislatures to ensure that at the same time that they're allowing for greater access to the voting booth, that they're also ensuring that the integrity of elections is also maintained. Because there's two ways to engage in voter suppression. One way is to make it difficult for law-abiding citizens to be able to vote. The other way is to allow people that are not registered to vote or are not legally permitted to vote in such a way that cancels out the vote of everyone that is legally permitted to vote. And so that's why it's so important that we maintain easy access to the ballot, but that we also maintain the integrity of our elections as well. So I hope that answers your questions. Again, please tune in next Monday, where we'll be releasing the next podcast on criminal justice reform and law enforcement reform. Again, if you have questions that you would like us to ask or answer or address, please go to podcast.nic4va.com. Get your questions in there so that we can either read them off on air or we can incorporate them into the solutions as we address the various problems that we're going to be discussing next week. Once again, thank you very much for joining us. Please consider giving us a 5-star rating. If you have a friend, family member, coworker that has questions about where I stand on government transparency, reform, and fixing the way that Washington, D.C. does business, please share this podcast with them. We offered 3 good solutions between one issue per bill, the REINS Act, and term limits that I think would really do a lot to fix the way that DC does business. So if they've ever got a question, we've got the answers right here. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.